Okay, here we have First Dog on the Moon.
Hello, Patriots, and welcome to First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living. I'm the Walkley Award-winning editorial cartoonist for The Guardian Australia, First Dog on the Moon. Haven't things been quiet? You hear that? Nothing. Politics is off the front page thanks to Malcolm. The adults are back in charge. Oh, no, wait a minute. There we were thinking that a golden age of satire had been laid to rest, yet the nation awoke the other day to the sound of laughter so loud we heard it from the other side of the world. That's right, Tony Abbott's on vacation. The age of entitlement is over. Seize. Good holiday starts today.
La cucaracha, ya no puede caminar, porque no tiene, porque le falta un cigarro que fumar.
Tony has packed his spare shirt front and some onions for the plane and flown first class to London. He's been invited to address a special meeting of England's finest conservative minds. It was in a phone box. Hello? I'm sorry, that joke is older than Gerard Henderson. Seriously, though, it was actually a very fancy affair. Former Prime Minister Abbott was invited to the official Margaret Thatcher charity Vagabond Taunting, where, as the guest of honour, he was to hurl the first epithet. It's a very prestigious awareness raiser and fundraiser for the tragic plight of the mildly inconvenienced and also well-off. It's held every year at historic Foppety Woofington Hall in the heart of London, just off the Chittingsway in Poodle-shafting Bumforth. Before the event gets underway, a random vagrant is grabbed on the street. You there, fellow! Bundled into a burlap sack, tossed in the boot of Jonty's roller, and whisked off. Later, they're paraded in front of an audience of extremely wealthy people who laugh and throw sticks. Ow! Then they're given £2 and a swift kick in the dungarees and sent on their way. Off you go. After that, everyone dines sumptuously on the traditional English feast of blimpets, larding cake, and a big roast bloffet prepared in the time-honoured fashion, boiled for a week in a vat of badger fat and rendered nubbing. It's delicious. Then there's a lot of drinking and a speech, and this was Tony's time to shine. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get a recording of the speech, so today the part of former Prime Minister Tony Abbott will be read from a transcript by Darren. Hello! Tony began his speech by saying that he was Prime Minister of the most successful government in the history of freedom. I was Prime Minister of the most successful government in the history of freedom. I showed Vladimir Putin my bottom, we undid a tax thing, and we stopped the boats with gulags. Tony then went on to warn the audience about the impending arrival of millions of asylum seekers fleeing war-torn countries. Listen up, Europe! A tide of humanity, an ocean of economic migrants, a tsunami of foreigners fleeing so-called war, a river of Muslims, 1 million bathtubs worth of grasping, swarthy folk are on their way here to diddle your crumpets. Tony Abbott then suggested they set up their own deterrent facilities. Set up your own deterrent facilities, he went on. Our policy was to shove desperate, not very white people into rapey, violent, brutal hellholes. We've got a lot of racist folks doing it in Australia, and I'm proud to say those policies haven't changed at all. Aside from the 1,600 people, including children, still in there being driven insane as a lesson to the others. Well, yes, there is that. But anyway, Europe has a long history of putting people in camps, so it shouldn't be too hard to get it off the ground. Also, I'd like to recommend doing a few other things that worked splendidly well for me as Prime Minister. For example, tell literally hundreds and hundreds of lies. Say you'll do one thing, then do the exact opposite. And make Prince Philip a knight. By the time you've finished, you'll all be the most popular man in the country and still Prime Minister like I am. And with that, he passed out under a statue depicting Winston Churchill rescuing a kitten from a tree. So thanks for listening, Patriots. This has been First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living, brought to you by the First Dog on the Moon Institute.
Yes. Well, I pretty much agree with everything that the first dog on the moon had to say concerning Tony Abbott going to England to address a bunch of Tories, opening his mouth and making Australia look like shit on a stick on the international stage. And guess what? He was paid $400,000 to go and do it. Tony Abbott, $400,000 to give a lecture in which he called for race war in Europe. That's what he called for. He said that force will be necessary in order to prevent the forced migration of people who are leaving an area where there is no possibility of living because there's a battle going on. The fact that they've gone to another country means that once they move from the first place they run away to, he says they're no longer refugees from conflict, they're all economic migrants. And of course, Tony of the Abertonians, his side of politics would know a bloody lot about economic migrants. It was his personal mentor, Johnny Flackjacket Howard, whom none would dare call a snivelling coward. He's a dance to the music of pale-faced Pauline, without the brains of a peanut, but she'd love to meet the Queen. It was Johnny Howard who introduced the business migration scheme into Australia. Now, what was going on was that they let a fella called Nelson Mandela out of jail in Sooth EffriKan. And while he was in jail, anybody who was white and had money had to leave their money in South Africa if they wanted to leave. And an awful lot of people who were really attached to the idea of living in a slave-based economy and being rich stayed in South Africa because that's where their money was. It was their ancestral pile that, generations had been raping the environment in order to accumulate, and they didn't want to leave their money behind. So if you met a white South African in Australia while Mandela was still in jail, you were probably talking to a reasonably nice person because they'd walked away from a pile of money to get here. In the history of Nelson Mandela being in jail, I only ever met one white South African who actually got his money out to Australia, and what he did was he built a sailing boat. He built his sailing boat out of concrete, and then he launched his sailing boat, and then he got it to the point where you could kind of pitch a tent and camp on it, and he sold his house, and then he used the money from his house to finish building his sailing boat and giving it a mast and spars and sails, and filled it up with everything you need to have a really good sailing boat. And then he said to the apartheid government, "Tally ho, old fellas, I'm going for a bit of a sail." And he showed up in bloody Australia and sold his boat and bought a block of land and built a house on it. The only good white South African I've ever met who got his money out while Mandela was still in jail. But Johnny Howard come along, see? And Johnny Howard said, "Oh, look, we really need a new ruling class. We need to inject some bulk onto the right side of politics. So if you got $1 million, if you just show us a bank account in your name with $1 million in it or more, we won't ask how you got the money, where it came from, whether it's clean money, dirty money, been through the laundry 4 times money. If it's money, and we want a ruling class." So at the same time, Nelson Mandela got let out of jail, and he said, "All you fascists who don't want to live here, don't want to be a part of a free and democratic South Africa, take your money and piss off." So there were a whole bunch of white supremacists cashed up looking for somewhere to go in the world where they could treat black people badly. And they were advised by the tens of thousands that, was it Smuts? I don't know. There was some really famous white South African general, might have been De Boer or somebody like that. After the First World War, when South Africa was a paid up, fully true believing, happy little member of the British Commonwealth, he came to Queensland and he had a look at how the Queensland Native Policing Act had been used to segregate the white society as the rulers and the black people as the workers and the underdogs. And he went back and he wrote up the plan for the apartheid regime based on Queensland. So the white South African white supremacists were told in so many words, take your money and go to Australia. So there's a big nest of them in Perth, and they showed up over here and they more or less took over the political and media and financial and intellectual mainstream of Australia. You listen to a spokesperson from a think tank on the radio, and you're going to be listening to a when we accent. When we were back on the Cape, when we were in South Africa, when we could keep slaves, when you could beat people. The when we's. Okay, now here in Glen Innes, there's a few people who've been talking about forming a bit of a reception committee to welcome some refugees from Syria, because we'd like to do our bit to try and, make their life in a little bit less miserable. And we've tried to do this before, like when there was a big influx of Vietnamese refugees, back when Fraser was the Prime Minister. The local Lions Club and the Rotary Club, they all sort of got together, and Apex Club, and they pooled their resources, and I think they bought a house, and they sponsored a Vietnamese family of refugees to come to town. And there was nobody for them to talk to, and they had no support groups. They had no sort of life in a little country town, and they got unhappy, and they became sick, and there was an awful lot of money spent shuttling them backwards and forwards to the city to where the doctors were that they wanted to talk to, and they left. So the previous experience is that it was not a success, but not because they were refugees who were resettled in Glen Innes by the local reception committee or any kind of a danger or a disruption to life in a small country town. It was just they didn't like it here. I have seen something that I'm going to share with you. The reception committee didn't actually achieve their ends last time, but anyway, there's a new reception committee, and they would like to have something to do with resettling some refugees. And they had a meeting to discuss the manoeuvre. And wouldn't you know it, we got a bloke stand up there, claims to be a local. He's lived at Glen Elgin for a couple of years. And he's got a when we accent. And he's trying to tell the people of Glen Innes that it's a really bad idea to open your arms to people from faraway places because they have cultural differences and they won't fit in. And he's a when we. And he's pushing for Glen Innes to close its doors to refugees from Syria. He's barking at shadows, and he didn't go to the local kindergarten, so I don't think he knows jack diddly shit about what is local in terms of an attitude or a culture or a mindset, because he's not a local. All the reasons that he says we should not open our town to refugees from Syria, they're all the same reasons why I don't think we should really open our town to refugees from white South Africa. We should send him back to wherever he came from, because he wants to send the Syrians back to whatever strife they're trying to avoid. Why is it that being a white South African with yellow dyed hair and blue bug eyes means that he gets to tell us how to live in Australia? I just don't see it that way. I'm really pissed off that one bunch of migrants on Australia is trying to lock another bunch of migrants out of Australia. And that's pretty much how the thing is going at the moment. I'm having a few kangaroos put on a few shows, as well as the swamp wallabies over there in Mating Corner. There we go. See? The secret is cooperation. I don't think the Syrians are going to be particularly happy when they come to Australia to run away from a war. They'll probably still be wearing their traditional national costume in 150 years, looking for a goat to milk among the olive trees, because that's what they want to do, in the same way that the Scottish are still running around wearing tam o' shanters and kilts and listening to bagpipes, because that's what they want to do. They don't actually want to be in Australia. So, I guess, approaching of the upload limit, Wobbles on a lot to YouTube. Life's like that. Ciao.